So the first answer, I guess, or the first answer to a question that I had that I really think deserves some explanation is one from one of the episodes 5 or 6, and that was that I was in the middle of forming a part and it was left with a wavy surface, and I walked away from the camera and said that I was going to run it through some dies. And at the time of doing that, I had also been using shrinking dies for some of the parts, and I think there might have been some confusion about that because I didn't really show the dies that I was going to run it through. So I'm over here in the far corner by the compressor and the New Zealand flag, but also more importantly by the bead roller. Now, this bead roller is another tool that I made when I was an apprentice. I'm gonna switch the mic around here and I'll get into it further. So when you look at this thing, it's a little rough. It's it's not beautiful. I was likely a teenager when I built it, and what I did was I took a piece of 1/4-inch steel checker plate that was laying around, flipped it inside out. I don't know if you can see the checker pattern in there, and used that. So I never really truly finished it well, and I had the habit of building equipment and not finishing it, and I don't like doing that anymore. So one day maybe if I have the time I'll go back to this, but for now it works wonderfully. When I built it as a hand-operated machine. So there's 2 gears back here. You can see them down in there, I believe. But because of the size of it, I think it's 32 or 36 inches of throat, it was really hard to crank that handle on the far side and get an eyeball on what you're doing with dies over here. So I've now converted it to an electric machine with forward reverse, and I can get my eyes right on exactly what I'm doing here to make sure it's as accurate as possible. So back to the question answer deal. This machine is what I used to take care of a ruffle on a flange. And what had happened was the part was being formed and the flange was left with a wavy surface. I had mentioned that it was going through the dies, and I don't want you guys to be confused with that I was doing another shrinking or stretching operation. What I did is I brought it over to this bead roller and I put these nylon dies on it. They're just a chunk of machined nylon with a keyway in them to drive. And I rolled the flange through here and put mild pressure on it, but not enough to really compress anything. And what that did is it took a lot of the wave out or the ruffle. And by doing that, it shows or amplifies where the work is needed to bring it back to where it was. So it gave me a few tips there. I made sure that I was right with my thinking, and I was able to carry on from there. But I didn't show it, so I hope this helps you guys. That's what I use that for. Now, one word of caution though, even with nylon dies, they're softer than using steel dies, but even with nylon dies, if you put a piece of O material in there and you crank it down too much and you compress that material and run it through the die, that amount of pressure that you put on it is going to compress the material a little bit and you're going to get stretch. And it's amazing how little compression you need to stretch that flange. So when I look at using shrinking and stretching dies on a shrinker stretcher, I typically don't use stretching dies, only because there's so many ways to stretch material. It's really quite easy to stretch it. It's harder to bring it back. So I use those composite shrinking dies on the shrinker stretcher, and typically I'll use hammer work or a set of dies like these on a long flange with adjustment of pressure along the flange to make sure it does what I want. If you remember in those episodes, I also showed a steel die. Now this is a die that I'd made for specifically for the fuselage frame segments on the Typhoon, and it's actually the female die from a beading die, so not the right size, but this is a male die, and they would sit against each other like that, if you can see it. But I just modified my existing die set, and I put the correct thickness here. I took the end down a little bit, and I put the correct radius on there, and it's a perfect match for the inside of the channel on all of the rear frames in the forward monocoque section. So I run it through there with typically with a steel die on the bottom. So let's change these up. We'll take these guys off, and I'll show you the die setup just as I had in the video. Again, I don't think the keyway's in that one, but oh yeah, it is. I'm just setting this up to show you guys what I was doing and explain a couple other little bits here. So now with those dies on, I could run that channel flange, which would wrap around this way. I could run it through there and not only true up the radius, but if that flange needed a bit more stretch, this tool does an amazing job. It imparts a beautiful finish on it because they're polished dies, takes any marking out of the L-clad, and allows for very, very controlled stretching. And one thing I'd say is be careful. And Martin Cherniff, another structures guy that works with us here, he has a good term for it, and he says don't get greedy, because you put a lot of work into these parts, and it doesn't take much to over tighten it, over compress it, and really get greedy and try and get it done in one pass. If you overstretch it, then you're dealing with trying to shrink it, and you've got two bends, and you're gonna have to open things up, and it just gets ugly after that. So take your time, go really slow, but this is an amazing stretching machine when you need to stretch a flange around a compound edge. So there you go, guys. I hope that helps explain the procedure that I missed showing in the previous video. The bead roller really is a really cool tool to have, and it's really something that you can apply to a lot of work here in the shop. And if you use it right, you can get a beautiful, beautiful product with it. I'm sure it's something that's going to make more appearances as we progress with the build of Hawker Typhoon JP843 here at Typhoon Legacy. In the meantime, keep the questions coming. I'll keep answering them, and we'll go from there. Take care, guys. Cheers.